The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the shock on Miran's face when Wook stood up, his voice cutting through the entire restaurant like a blade. "That woman you just slapped," he said, his eyes cold as winter in Seoul, "is my wife, and you're going to apologize to her. Now." The entire room went silent. Miran's face turned white as snow. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of her downfall. "My name is Haiwan, and I've learned that sometimes the best weapon against arrogance is patience." I smoothed my simple black dress as I entered the private dining room of the Shilla Hotel, the Kim family's monthly gathering, Seoul's most exclusive circle of chaebol heirs and their wives. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over tables adorned with white orchids, and the city's skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows. I was here as a guest of my college friend Young, whose husband owned a mid-tier pharmaceutical company. "Haiwan, you made it." DeYoung rushed over, her relief obvious. She'd been trying to introduce me to their circle for months, worried I was becoming too isolated in my work. "Thank you for inviting me," I said, bowing politely. The room was filled with designer gowns and enough jewelry to fund a small country. Hermes bags hung casually from chair backs like everyday accessories. "Everyone, this is my dear friend Haiwan," DeYoung announced to the nearest group. "She's a financial consultant specializing in corporate acquisitions." I felt the subtle shift in the room's energy. Eyes evaluated my off-the-rack dress, my modest accessories, my lack of recognizable designer labels. I smiled warmly, unbothered. These social performances were as familiar to me as boardroom negotiations. A woman in a blood-red Chanel dress approached us, her smile sharp as her stilettos. Everything about her screamed expensive, from her perfectly styled hair to her diamond tennis bracelet that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Miran," she introduced herself with practiced charm. "I'm engaged to Prosecutor General Park's son. We're planning our wedding for next spring at the Grand Hyatt." She paused dramatically. "And you work in finance?" "I do," I replied simply, noting how she emphasized finance like it was something distasteful. "How practical," Miran said, her tone suggesting it was anything but complimentary. "DeYoung, where exactly did you meet your friend? You two seem so different." The subtle insult wasn't lost on me. Miran was establishing the social hierarchy, her at the top, me somewhere far below. "Seoul National University," DeYoung said proudly, missing the undercurrent of tension. Haiwan graduated summa cum laude from the business school. She was student body president and won the Dean's Award for Academic Excellence. Miran's laugh was like breaking glass. "Education is wonderful, but it doesn't change where someone comes from. Does it? Breeding and background. That's what truly matters in our circle." Other conversations around us began to quiet as people sensed the brewing confrontation. Mrs. Lee, the pharmaceutical company chairman's wife, looked uncomfortable. Young Hee, a fashion designer's daughter, pretended to study her phone while clearly listening. "You're absolutely right," I said, setting down my wine glass with deliberate calm. "Nothing can change our origins. I'm grateful for mine. They taught me the value of earning what I have rather than inheriting it." Miran's eyes flashed dangerously. She wasn't expecting that response, especially not delivered with such serene confidence. "How refreshingly humble," she said, venom coating her words. "Though I imagine it must be exhausting, constantly having to prove yourself worthy of rooms like this." "Actually," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily, "I find it's much more exhausting to watch people who've never earned anything try to convince themselves they deserve everything." A sharp intake of breath from someone nearby. DeYoung's face had gone pale, but I noticed Mrs. Lee hide a small smile behind her wine glass. Miran's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about your place here tonight." "Oh, I understand my place perfectly," I said, my voice soft but carrying clearly across the now silent room. The question is, do you understand yours? The battle lines had been drawn. Miran had no idea she'd just declared war on the wrong woman. The dinner progressed like a carefully choreographed dance of status and power. Servers moved silently between tables, refilling wine glasses and presenting course after course of artfully arranged dishes. I listened more than I spoke, observing the intricate social hierarchy playing out around the table, like a chess match where everyone thought they knew which pieces they were playing. "Hi, One, tell us about your work," asked Mrs. Lee, the pharmaceutical company chairman's wife. Her tone was genuinely curious, a stark contrast to the barely concealed hostility radiating from Miran's direction. "Corporate acquisitions sounds fascinating. I specialize in corporate restructuring and merger acquisitions," I explained, cutting my beef with precise movements. "I help companies optimize their financial strategies during major transitions, mergers, hostile takeovers, international expansions. It's like solving complex puzzles where every piece affects the whole picture." "How intellectually stimulating," said Young Hee, leaning forward with interest. "Do you work internationally?" "Frequently. Last month I was in Singapore, before that London and New York. The global market requires understanding cultural nuances as much as financial ones." Miran cleared her throat loudly. "How fascinating that must be for you," she interjected, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Do you work for anyone we might know? Any of the major chaebols, perhaps?" The question was loaded. In Korea's business world, working for a top-tier chaebol was the ultimate status symbol. Miran was fishing, hoping to expose me as someone who worked for smaller, less prestigious companies. "I prefer to keep my client list confidential," I replied calmly, taking a sip of wine. "Professional discretion is paramount in my field." Miran leaned forward like a shark sensing blood. "Of course, I'm sure your clients appreciate discretion, especially if they're not exactly top-tier companies. Sometimes smaller businesses need help looking bigger than they really are, don't they?" A few uncomfortable laughs rippled around the table. DeYoung looked mortified, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. Mrs. Lee frowned at Miran's obvious rudeness, but said nothing. "Actually," I said, setting down my glass with deliberate precision, "discretion is valued most by top-tier clients. They tend to have the most to protect: trade secrets, strategic plans, sensitive negotiations. The bigger the deal, the more critical confidentiality becomes." "I'm sure you'd know all about big deals," Miran said, her smile growing sharper. "After all, you probably see a lot of companies trying to look bigger than they really are. It must give you quite an education in social climbing." The insult was barely veiled now. The entire table had gone quiet, even the servers seeming to sense the tension as they paused in their service. I looked directly at her, my expression unchanged. In my experience, the companies that feel the need to constantly broadcast their importance are usually compensating for fundamental weaknesses. True power speaks for itself. It doesn't need to announce its presence or diminish others to feel significant. Miran's face flushed deep red, clashing with her dress. "How would someone like you know about true power? You're sitting at this table as a charity case, a friend's pity project. Someone like me?" I raised an eyebrow, my voice dangerously quiet. "Well, you're clearly not from this world." She gestured dismissively at my understated appearance. "Your dress, your background, your desperate attempts to sound sophisticated. You're playing dress-up in a game you don't understand. We can all see it." The silence was deafening. DeYoung looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Young He stared at her plate, clearly uncomfortable with Miran's escalating aggression. I smiled, the kind of smile that had closed billion-1 deals and made seasoned CEOs nervous. Miran was about to learn exactly which game I'd been playing all along. "You know what I think?" Miran continued, emboldened by what she mistook for my silence as submission. She stood up slightly, commanding the attention of the entire room. I think people should stay in their appropriate social circles. It prevents misunderstandings and embarrassment for everyone involved. Her voice carried that particular tone wealthy Koreans used when they wanted to remind someone of their place. Cold, authoritative, designed to make the target feel small. Misunderstandings can indeed be costly, I agreed, my voice steady as I continued eating, especially when someone makes assumptions without having all the information. In the business world, we call that inadequate due diligence. What information could possibly change the obvious? Miran snapped, her composure cracking. Look around this room, High One. Everyone here represents old money, established families, generational wealth. We're connected by more than just friendship. We're connected by breeding, by history, by blood. She paused dramatically, clearly enjoying what she thought was her moment of triumph. You're a nobody trying to climb the social ladder through friendship connections. It's pathetic, really. And frankly, it's insulting to the rest of us who belong here by right. The words hung in the air like poison. DeYoung gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Mrs. Lee's face had hardened into disapproval, but she seemed frozen by the social awkwardness of the situation. Miran, that's quite enough, Mrs. Lee said sharply, finally finding her voice. You're being incredibly rude to a guest. But Miran was beyond reason now, intoxicated by her own perceived superiority and the attention she was commanding. Her eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction as she looked down at me. No, someone needs to say it, she declared, standing fully now and moving around the table toward me. This is exactly what's wrong with our society, people who don't belong trying to infiltrate spaces they're not wanted, pretending to be something they're not. She stopped beside my chair, towering over me with barely contained rage. The other diners watched in horror, like witnesses to a car accident. You want to know what I really think of women like you, she hissed, her face contorted with contempt. Social climbers who think they can buy their way into respectability with a few business achievements. I looked up at her with genuine curiosity, my expression calm despite the volatile energy radiating from her. Actually, I'm quite interested in your perspective. Please continue. My composure seemed to infuriate her further. Her hands were trembling now, her breathing shallow. You disgust me, she spat, sitting there so smug, thinking you fooled anyone. We all see through your act. You're common, you're ordinary, and you don't belong here. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. Everyone was frozen, waiting for my response, for me to finally break under her assault. Instead, I reached for my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. That's when Miran completely lost control. How dare you ignore me? She shrieked, raising her hand high. The slap connected with my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the private dining room like a gunshot. Everyone froze in absolute shock. Slowly, I touched my cheek, feeling the sting bloom across my skin. The metallic taste of blood touched my lip where her ring had caught me. Then I heard it, the scraping of a chair against the marble floor behind me. Excuse me. The voice was low, controlled, and absolutely lethal. Every head in the room turned toward the sound like flowers following the sun. The real show was just beginning. A man in an impeccably tailored navy suit stood up from a corner table I hadn't even noticed, partially hidden behind a decorative screen. He was tall, commanding, with the kind of presence that made room temperature drop by degrees. His movements were fluid, predatory, like a panther emerging from shadow. That woman you just slapped, he said, walking toward us with measured steps that somehow felt more threatening than running, is my wife. The blood drained from Miran's face so quickly I thought she might faint. Around the table, I heard sharp intakes of breath, the clatter of someone dropping their fork, the soft thud of Mrs. Lee setting down her wine glass too hard. And you're going to apologize to her. Now. Wook stopped beside my chair, his hand gently touching my shoulder. The gesture was possessive, protective, and absolutely devastating to Miran's worldview. The entire room was paralyzed, everyone staring at us like we were actors in a drama they couldn't quite believe was real. "You're your wife," Miran stammered, looking between us in horror. Her perfectly applied makeup was starting to smudge as perspiration beaded on her forehead. "Lee J. Wook," he introduced himself with deadly calm, though everyone in the room already knew exactly who he was. The youngest CEO in Daehan Group's history, one of Korea's most powerful chaebols, a man whose casual decisions affected thousands of jobs and billions in revenue. But she's just a financial consultant," Miran whispered, her voice barely audible. Jae Wook's laugh was arctic, sending visible shivers through the assembled guests. "Just a financial consultant? My wife is the head of strategic acquisitions for Daehan Group. She's been personally responsible for our last 3 major international expansions, including the London banking merger and the Singapore tech acquisition that made headlines last month." He paused, letting that sink in while Miran's face grew increasingly pale. The discretion she mentioned earlier? She was being modest about the fact that she can't discuss most of her work because it involves state-level economic policies and deals that could affect Korea's international trade relationships. I stood up slowly, smoothing my simple black dress, which, as anyone with real fashion knowledge would recognize, was a custom piece from Kim Seo-ryong, a Korean designer whose waiting list was 2 years long and whose pieces started at 30 million won. "Jae Wook, darling," I said softly, placing my hand over his on my shoulder. "It's fine. Not everyone recognizes quality when they see it. Some people are so focused on surface appearances that they miss what's actually valuable." Miran was now visibly shaking, her designer clutch trembling in her hands. I didn't know. I never meant." "No," Jae-wook said, his voice cutting through her stammered apologies like ice. "You didn't know because you were too busy judging based on your own limited understanding of worth. You assumed that because my wife doesn't flaunt her background, she must not have one." He turned to address the entire table, though his words were clearly meant for Miran and anyone else who might share her views. "My wife and I chose to keep our marriage private until now because we value substance over spectacle. We didn't announce it in the society pages or throw elaborate parties because we don't need public validation of our relationship." He pulled out his phone, never taking his eyes off Miran's increasingly horrified face. But since someone decided to publicly assault her based on ignorant assumptions, he dialed a number, putting the phone to his ear. The room was so quiet everyone could hear when someone answered. "Father? Yes, it's Jae-wook. I need you to reconsider the Park family proposal we discussed last week." "No, permanently. Someone just laid hands on your daughter-in-law at a public dinner." Miran's face went from pale to green. The Park family's business empire depended heavily on connections with chaebols like the Lees. Her fiancé's father had been negotiating a major construction contract with Daehan Group for months. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I didn't know." "You're not sorry you did it," I interrupted, my voice calm but carrying clearly across the silent room. "You're sorry you chose the wrong target. There's a difference, and everyone here knows it." I picked up my purse, a vintage Hermes Kelly bag that had belonged to Jae-wook's grandmother, and looked around the table at the stunned faces. "DeYoung, thank you for dinner. Ladies, it's been educational." As Jae-wook and I walked toward the door, I heard him make another call, his voice carrying deliberately. "Security, this is Lee Jae-wook. The woman in the red dress is no longer welcome at any Daehan Group properties or affiliated establishments." "Yes, that includes the Shilla, Lotte hotels, the country club, and the department stores. Permanent ban." Behind us, I heard Miran break down in tears, her sobs echoing through the room as the full impact of her actions hit her. Her social standing, her engagement, her access to Seoul's most exclusive venues, all destroyed by one moment of arrogant cruelty. Outside, Jae-wook took my hand as we walked to the elevator. "How was your first official appearance as Mrs. Lee?" he asked with a slight smile. "Quite satisfying," I replied, touching the fading sting on my cheek. "Though I think next time we should just wear our wedding rings." "Where's the fun in that?" he laughed, pulling me close as the elevator doors closed. Miran had learned an expensive lesson about assumptions, and I had learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply being exactly who you are.